I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak. Please give him a warm welcome.
So it's like confession first. I've brought some of my southern germs up with me. So my voice is a little bit kind of croaky, so I hope you can hear me at the back, but equally don't come and sit on the front row because you might catch my germs. So let's do a bit of a straw poll, some straw polls. So who would say in the kind of the majority of their experience, hands up if you think you generally work in environments where you have detailed instruction on what to do rather than clear intent. So hands up if you kind of generally, it's more about having been given the detailed instruction on what to do and you're not quite sure on what the intent is. Okay, a few hands, not too many. So hands up if you kind of, you have clear intent then? Okay, still a few hands. Hands up if you've not put your hand up yet. Okay, all right. It's going to be one of those evenings. All right, let's try again. Hands up if you think you generally work for organisations where being indispensable is more important than becoming redundant. So what I mean by that is being indispensable is I have to keep my job, I have to be the expert. Becoming redundant is it's okay, I'm going to teach other people how to do my job so that when I leave, the organisation can thrive without me. So hands up if being indispensable is generally more important. Okay, hands up if becoming redundant is... Okay, all right, this is good. Last one. What about avoiding errors or achieving success? So hands up if you work in organisations where avoiding errors is paramount. And hands up if achieving success is important, it doesn't matter if you make some errors. Okay, good. So that's pretty positive, actually. So those three questions are kind of tie into what I kind of talking about at the moment as leading, lasting learning. So leading is about being really clear on intent. Good leadership, I think, is making absolute clarity on why we want you to do something. I don't care how you do it, but here's the intent of what I'm asking you to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and specifically introduce a tool called the X Matrix to do that. Lasting is about developing people. So there's this thing where leaders come into organisations or managers come into organisations and it's all about do it my way, and success is based on that manager's job now and the success of the organisation where the manager is while the manager is there. To me, success is more about how successful the organisation is after the manager has left, which means that manager needs to develop the people and they need to help the organisation figure out how do we solve problems without the manager to tell them what to do. And we do that actually by being clear on intent. So I'll talk a little bit about catchball as a way to develop people. And then learning is about befriending failure. So I try not to talk about celebrating failure because we don't want to fail all the time. But a lot of organisations, failure is seen as a bad thing. And we talk about there's no such thing as failure. There's only, there's lots of learning going on. I kind of come around to the idea that actually we should talk more about failure. If we don't talk about failure, it's still seen as a bad thing. It's okay to fail sometimes. That's when we generate information and that's how we learn. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can run experiments. And I think if we're running experiments, we're following kind of the catchball process and we have techniques like the X Matrix, we can create organisations where there's leadership, the organisation is successful over the long term, and the organisation is really learning how to be successful. And what I'm really talking about is strategy. So I highly recommend this book by Richard Rummel, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. He talks about a strategy kernel as having three parts to it. So, he talks about the kernel, a bit like a software kernel. It's not everything, but it's the core. There's the bits you really need. So we need to have a diagnosis. We need to really understand what problems we're trying to solve when we're building software, we're developing products. Why are we doing it? What's the core problem? Well, if we can understand the diagnosis, then we can put some guiding policies in place that help us make decisions on what should we do and what should we not do, and then we can take coherent action and actually decide what we're going to invest in. If we just tell people what to do, all we're doing is action. It's probably not even coherent action. And people can't decide what the right thing to do is because they don't really know what the problem they're trying to solve is. So leading lasting learning is really about making sure people understand what's the diagnosis, what's the problem we're trying to solve as an organisation, what's stopping us being successful as an organisation, What are the key policies that are going to help us make decisions about what we do and the way we approach solving the problem? And then what are we actually going to do and what things are we going to try to figure out how we solve the problem? Which effectively is strategy deployment or Hoshinkanri. So this is really what I'm talking about. So Hoshinkanri is Japanese word or Japanese term, but the English translation that I like is strategy deployment. This is kind of a nice metaphorical description of what it is, ship in a storm going in the right direction. So the storm is the problem, the environment that our organisations are facing, you know, economic turbulence and financial turbulence and competitive turbulence, you know, all these things that are going on that are constantly changing. We need to get our organisations kind of out of the storm into safe harbour. So let's get everybody clear on the direction we need to go in to get to the safe harbour. We're not going to tell people how to do their jobs, how to row the boat or how to sail. If people know where we need to get to, we trust that people have the skills to get us there. The more literal translation is direction management. So it's not about managing people on what to do, it's managing people on what direction we want to go in. And the direction being we need to solve these critical challenges or we need to take these key opportunities. This is the way I like to think about it. And this is almost kind of the benefit that I think if we take a strategy deployment approach to our change, we want to create organisations which can improve where solutions emerge from the people closest to the problem. It's not about our management and our leaders saying, we have a problem and here's how we're going to solve it, do this. It's managers saying, we have a problem, I'm not sure how we're going to solve this problem. I've got these ideas about a good approach to take. What do you think we should do? Let's try things out. Give me some ideas. Give me some feedback. Let's run some experiments, see what works and what doesn't work. It's kind of having the humility to say we don't know how to solve the problem, but let's all kind of be clear on the intent of what the problem we're trying to solve is, and let's try things out. So I think we can apply this idea to successful agile transformations. Agile isn't somebody coming in and saying, we're going to go agile, here's how we're going to do it, we're going to implement SAFe, do it. It's about saying, okay, we have some challenges here. We think Agile might help us solve these challenges. Let's figure out and help us figure, and kind of saying to the organisation, help us figure out how we can best use Agile to solve those challenges. Okay, so we'll kind of talk through each of these sections, leading and lasting and learning one by one. The idea of leadership and clarifying intent actually goes back to the Prussian Army. So I highly recommend another book. I'm going to recommend a number of books, and I've got a slide at the end that has all the books on it. Stephen Bunge's book, The Art of Action, and he goes back and he looks at the Prussian Army and the way the Prussian Army changed the way they operated in order to become a really successful army, kind of, and winning lots of battles. Previously, there's this idea that of alignment on autonomy were two extremes of the same scale. You could have one or the other, but you couldn't have both. Because clearly, if you had alignment, you got alignment by telling people what to do, and therefore you had no autonomy. Or you could get autonomy by letting people do what they liked, but if people are doing what they liked, clearly you're going to have no alignment. So what the insight from the Prussian Army was that actually these are not two ends of the same scale, they're completely independent axes, and you can have both. You get alignment by being really clear on the intent. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What's the kind of overarching mission? And therefore you can allow people to take action to meet that intent. So you can, by doing that, and it starts with being clear on intent, you can allow people to have the autonomy. So there's a model that I use to try and do this. One is, so it's called, I call it TASTE, because every model has a good acronym. So we start off with True North. So True North is the direction we're going to go in. So it's another lean idea. I kind of think of it as orientation. We want the whole organisation to be heading in the same direction, and we make decisions based on, will that decision take us towards our True North? Or is this decision going to take us away from our True North? So it's the kind of the really top level thing. And then we have aspirations. Our aspirations are the thing that we'd like to achieve. If we meet our True North, we should be able to achieve these results. It's kind of it's a measure of our ambition as an organisation. But we need to do things differently. There are challenges or opportunities that we need to take in order to meet those aspirations. There's an assumption here that business as usual doesn't cut it. Okay? We need to improve somehow. So how do we improve? We need to put a strategy in place. So strategy, and the thing that links aspirations and strategy really is that notion of diagnosis. Understand where we are now, what's our situational awareness, such that we start thinking about the guiding policies. What is it we need to do? What should we do and not do in order to meet those aspirations? And we can talk about that as strategy. That strategy then leads to tactics. So tactics are the decisions that we make. They're the things that we're going to invest in and what we're actually going to do. And then if we implement those tactics, we should see something. We should see some results, early results, that's giving us evidence that we're going to meet our aspirations. So True North really sits across the top of it. And then aspirations, strategy, tactics, evidence, we can think of it as a loop. We have some aspirations. We decide our strategy to meet those aspirations. We deploy some tactics. And those tactics generate the evidence. So slightly better, more visual way of looking at that. So aspirations are effectively they're the results. So if we're doing this on an annual cycle, we're going to plan out a year. At the end of the year, if we're successful, we should achieve these results, which means our aspirations are a lagging indicator, which means that we don't see the results until it's too late. So it's a long feedback cycle for aspirations. And typically I think of them as economic things. It's the sort of things that you go to your CFO and ask them what's in the annual budget. They're probably going to start thinking about that. They're going to start talking about their aspirations. Revenue, costs, number of customers, number of sales, number of subscriptions, those sorts of things. Sky Bet might be number of bets that we're making or something like that. So to meet those aspirations, we need to have strategies. So one way I like thinking about strategies are the constraints that we're going to have. If we have no strategies, we have no constraints, we can do absolutely everything. But strategies are about enabling us to make decisions. They're not telling us what to do, but they're enabling us to decide what to do. So enabling constraints, such that we have some flexibility. We can be creative. We can try lots of different things. We can start running experiments. But equally, it's going to help us decide what not to do. So if we're not making decisions, it's probably not a good strategy. Those strategies hopefully will lead to evidence. So evidence are then more what outcomes, intermediate outcomes, will we achieve which we think will lead to us meeting our aspirations. So this is leading metrics now. Faster feedback cycle on evidence, which are going to tell us, give us some indication that we're doing the right thing, or maybe we're doing the wrong thing and we need to change our tactics, or maybe we need to change our strategy. So usually it's things in terms of capabilities that we have. I think a lot of the metrics that Ian was showing in his talk effectively are evidence of the things that he was talking about. Well, are they working or not working? Are we developing things more quickly? Are we getting more customers? That's evidence that we're going to hit our revenue targets. But obviously strategies don't lead directly to evidence. So we actually implement our strategies with tactics. The tactics are the things that we're actually doing. They're really activity-based. I really prefer to talk about them in terms of experiments. We don't know whether this is going to work or not. And they're really the things that we're investing in. When we're going through a process of change, we're investing in certain types of work, certain changes that hopefully are aligned with our strategy. And actually it's those tactics which will directly lead to the evidence. And between each of these elements, there's these correlations, and we want there to be coherence between them. So this isn't a nice, neat, mechanistic, analytical thing where we can just go, oh yeah, to get this result, we need this strategy, and this strategy will be implemented with this tactic, and this tactic will directly lead to evidence. You actually end up with a kind of many-to-many correlation in here, where a particular result might get enabled by multiple strategies. And each strategy might get implemented by multiple tactics. And each tactic might impact multiple pieces of evidence. And each kind of piece of evidence might indicate that you're meeting multiple aspirations. And similarly the other way around. Each aspiration might relate to multiple pieces of evidence. Each evidence might be impacted by multiple tactics. So it's kind of messy. It's not this kind of nice, neat work breakdown structure. I kind of like the phrase messy coherence. You should be able to tell a story around this thing. So as we start talking about why we're talking strategy, we should be able to tell a nice coherent story about how each strategy contributes or doesn't contribute to each aspiration, etc. So it turns out that we can visualize this quite nicely. And this is where the X matrix comes in. So this is a nice template, single sheet of paper, where we can start showing all these things. So we have our list of aspirations, and I've got a really, really trivial one here. Our aspiration is to increase our sales. And we would probably put a figure in there to, the number of sales we want or the percentage increase we want. And we have a strategy that we want to release more often. I'm not saying it's a great strategy, but it's kind of probably one that's easy to understand. And this big solid dot means that there's kind of fairly direct correlation between increasing sales and more releases. So we kind of agree that if we have more releases, that should lead to more sales. You don't agree? Okay.
Absolutely not.
Excellent. That's good, because now we can have a conversation about this, and we can talk about why I think that and why you don't think that. We'll not have that conversation now, but I'll kind of come back to that. That's one of the benefits that we're starting to kind of visualize our assumptions here. And if people don't believe that, and there's some good reasons why that might be true, we can start fixing this early. I think there is, yeah. I can understand where you're coming from there, but play along for now. So let's say we agree that more releases is our strategy, and then we think that there's an assumption here, which I think is probably where you come from, that we're releasing the right features and the right releases. But in order to kind of release more as a strategy, how are we actually going to do that? So let's actually invest in continuous delivery as a tactical thing. Again, I think there's a strong correlation there. Okay, anybody disagree that continuous delivery correlates with more releases? Yeah, we've got general agreement there. And then if we've got continuous delivery as a tactic, what evidence should we see? Well, hopefully we'll see a lower lead time. So that time between us starting building a feature and having that feature in production should get shorter. And if we can start seeing our release times coming down, then that probably means continuous delivery as a tactic is working. Now, lower lead time down to more sales, this is a kind of a semi-solid dot, because I don't think that's a strong correlation there. I think there's maybe some correlation in there. Hopefully, if we get features delivered more quickly, it'll lead to more sales. But definitely, I don't think that's a direct correlation. So I've got that down as an indirect. So that's just kind of a simple loop round there. But I say we can have multiple aspirations, multiple strategies, multiple tactics, multiple pieces of evidence. And then we can start looking at, let's say, more sales has an indirect with this strategy, a direct strategy with correlation with that strategy. And you get these matrices in the corner where we can look at the correlation between each of these and each of these. And we might start spotting some patterns. So does anybody, anything stand out as interesting maybe in that? Any of the kind of the patterns? Sorry?
Some of them are symmetric.
Oh, sorry, I can't.
Sorry, I said some of them are symmetric, but that's irrelevant.
Yeah, so that's not intentional if they are symmetric. So it's kind of difficult when you're first coming to this. So what I kind of find would look at this and notice this tactic 2 here has no correlation to these strategies and only a weak correlation to this strategy here. And equally, it's only got direct correlation with one of our pieces of evidence and nothing with the rest of them. So I might ask, is this the best thing we should be doing? Because it doesn't seem like it's aligned to our strategies, and it doesn't seem it's making any difference to our important pieces of evidence. So one thing is this is the wrong thing to do. There are better things that we could be spending our time on. Or maybe our strategies are wrong, or maybe we're missing a piece of evidence. So it's really about having these conversations and getting alignment, because we all understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what are we doing, why are we doing it, how do we know whether it's working or not, and what are the end goals. And I said this is an A3, so A3 is another kind of lean thing. The idea is this just fits on an A3 piece of paper. It's really easy to visualize, it's really easy to go and talk to people about. It's not a big thick document that you have to read. Like any good consultant, I have my own framework, my own version of this that you can download. But this is the X matrix, and it's called the X matrix because you have these matrices that form an X, just in case that wasn't clear. So I find this is a really good way of getting clarity of intent, because we can have those conversations about why do I think this, and why do we not think this. So that's the intent side of things. But obviously this isn't just as something that we just kind of hand down. It's not like, right, we have an X matrix, go make it so, go implement these tactics. We want to get everybody involved. We want to have those conversations. So this is where the idea of catchball comes into it. Again, catchball is another idea that comes from the lean body of knowledge. But actually, before we go to talk about catchball itself, another book recommendation, David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around. So David Marquet was a commander on a nuclear submarine. Anybody kind of read this or heard about this? So highly recommend it. He took over kind of a failing submarine, and he turned it around. So it's not turned the ship around as in geographically. He kind of turned it from a failing submarine into one of the best submarines in the fleet. And he has this model that he calls leader. And one of the things he wants to do is he's giving control. It's rather than that traditional thing of commanders just giving orders and the crew following orders, he wanted to give control to the crew to make their own decisions, which meant he needed to develop people. So one, he needed to have clarity intent. So in order for him to give control, he needed people to really understand why they needed to take certain decisions and how to make certain decisions and why to make certain decisions. But also he needed people to have the competence to make decisions. You don't give somebody a decision to, so I think the one decision he said he would always make would be to press the big red button, because he felt it kind of wasn't right for him to delegate that decision. But if they're making a decision on when to surface and when not to surface the submarine, he wanted people to make sure they had the skills and the knowledge, the expertise to make those decisions. Because if somebody surfaced the submarine at the wrong time, not good for everybody. So I think you can take this idea of competence and growing people competence and mesh it onto that Stephen Bungay model of alignment and autonomy. So you've got alignment and autonomy. Let's add ability as a third word. And what we're really wanting to do is kind of move people up so they have clarity through giving them alignment. We start growing people, developing people so that they improve their ability to do their jobs, improve their craft, so that we can give people more autonomy and we can give control to people. But we need to do that by engaging with people. We can't just kind of send people on a training course, give people the intent and hope that they're going to do that. So we need to work with people. So this is where catchball comes into it. So it's literally the metaphor of throwing a ball around. It's really that simple. So you have an idea. We have this thing that we think we need to do. We have this strategy, and we may got some initial ideas around how to implement that strategy. Somebody you effectively toss that to somebody, a team or a group or some kind of somewhere else in the organisation. They will catch it, and they're going to reflect on that. They're going to think about what is it we've been asked to do, why we've been asked to do it, how might we go about it. What suggestions are there already in there? And we're going to improve on that idea. We're not just going to do it because we've been told to do it. Based on our reflection, we're going to actually come up with some new suggestions, some new ideas, and we're going to throw the ball to somebody else. We're going to pass it on. We might pass it back. We might pass it to another group within the organisation that we think can help us, or we think might have some good ideas. And it's another kind of 4-stage loop process. The balls, we're constantly passing ideas around the organisation, constantly reflecting on them, constantly trying to improve them. And this is how we kind of start developing people, because we're now involving them in decision making. We're actually engaging with them to get their input and get their ideas. A slightly more fun way of thinking about it is improv. Anybody know Neil Malarkey? I bet most people will recognise him. He was in Austin Powers, and have I got news for you? Whose line is it anyway? I'm one of the founding of the Comedy Store players. I saw him at Agile Cymru in Cardiff a few years back. One of the best keynotes I've ever seen. And he basically goes around and applies improv ideas and the rules of improv to businesses. And when I saw him do this keynote, it was just like, he's just describing the way I think about catchball. So he has a nice acronym that he calls LAGER, because if it's beer related, it must be good. So in improv, you listen actively for offers. So when you're working with somebody in comedy, you're kind of listening to the stuff they're giving you, and you always accept it. So there's that idea of yes and in improv. You never shut somebody down and say that's a rubbish idea. You always build on their ideas. So you always accept their offers, and then you give them something back. So building on each other's work. Explore your assumptions. So this is the idea of kind of reflecting and improving. Your own assumptions and everybody else's assumptions. So why did they say that they're dressed as a nurse when we're in the forest? Let's explore that. And then reincorporate previous offers. So that idea that best improv will have a running gag that's going through it, or they'll come back to an idea that was first mentioned 5 minutes ago. So I think when we're trying to improve our organisations and we're developing our people, always listen for the offers, listen for what people are doing and accept them, give them some feedback, build on those ideas, and reincorporate the ideas, and eventually the idea that the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Get everybody's idea involved. So I think of it like this. I was trying to figure out how to do this visually, diagrammatically. So you start off with this central group. Strategy still comes centrally, still comes from somewhere, and the different colours here kind of represent different areas of the organisation, maybe. And we're going to come up with some high-level tactics of some of the things initially we think we might want to do to improve the organisation, and we create some little subgroups, some teams. This is the start of catchball. We kind of start working with some other areas of the organisation to get their feedback. Now you'll notice that this person here is part of both that central group and this group. This isn't delegation. This is owning the work and starting to work with more people in the organisation. And then we can kind of continue doing that around the organisation. So we're passing ideas both kind of from this group out and around the organisation, both kind of from a top-down perspective, you can think of this, but also peer-to-peer as well. So really trying to get everybody involved, get their ideas, get their input, build on those ideas. And guess what? There's an A3 for this as well. So I think of this as back briefing. So when we're forming one of these groups here, you're effectively giving people a little mission. It's like, okay, there's this big tactical initiative that we'd like to invest in, but we're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to allow you to decide how to implement this. But you want to make sure that they've understood what you've asked them to do. So you get them to fill this in. You don't fill this in and give it to them. You give people the brief and then effectively get people to brief back to you. That's why we call it back briefing. They tell you how they've understood what you've asked them to do. So do they understand the context? What's the critical challenge or opportunity you're asking them to address? What are their goals in addressing that? And how does that help the organisation? So what's the higher intent? This is kind of their intent. This is almost kind of like, if this is what you're going to do, how does this help your boss meet his goals. If you understand how what you're doing helps your boss meet your goals, you're meeting the higher intent. This is how we drive alignment, by asking people to do something and get them to brief back. Who's involved? Who's going to be involved in it? What skills do we need? Any particular key people that we need? Boundaries. We're asking people, and we're giving people freedom to go off and come up with their own solutions. We need to make people sure that people are clear on what their freedoms are. So what can they do? But maybe there are some constraints in there. You know, don't go off and spend £1 million. Don't go off and completely rewrite the architecture. There are probably some things that we don't want them to do. And we want to make sure they understand where those constraints are. And then let's just start understanding their initial plan. What are their hypotheses that they're going to test? What are their ideas? So they fill this in, brief it back to the leadership team or the higher team. We can negotiate this, we can talk about it, we can refine it so that we really understand, one, we've now got their ideas and we're clear that their ideas are aligned with our intent. And it's all about the conversation. So another book that I would recommend, but the cautionary note on this one, it's a very slightly dry, boring book and very expensive, but it's got some nuggets of gold and things like this. It's the memory of what was said and felt that creates the alignment, not the final piece of paper. So kind of, I'm using A3s and a piece of paper as a mechanism to communicate the intent, but actually it's having the conversations around what decisions were made, why were those decisions were made, how were those decisions made for what goes on the piece of paper. That's the real value in there. People read Jeff Patton's user story mapping book? That's another good book. It's not on my book list. But he has this metaphor with user story mapping of a holiday photograph. So when you show somebody a holiday photograph, they might look at it and kind of go, that's interesting, that's a nice photograph. But they don't really know what that photograph is about. It doesn't have any meaning to them in the same way that it has meaning to you because you were there on holiday. Now, that's a memory for you. To them, it's just a picture. So this photograph in the background here is one of my favourite holiday photographs from a few years ago. You're probably looking at it and kind of going, that's a terrible photograph. It's out of focus. Can't see what it is. That's actually my daughter. And we were in Egypt and they'd kind of put on a foam party by the pool. We had a great time. Terrible photograph, but if I showed you that, it would be kind of meaningless to you. But to me, there's a lot of memories involved in it. So it's a similar sort of thing, I think, with A3s in general. Having that conversation, because that's how we develop people. We can give them feedback, we can get their feedback, we can kind of pool all these ideas together. The last bit then, learning. So even if we've got everybody's ideas together, and we've got lots of input, it's still a hypothesis. We still really don't know whether we're doing the right thing. We still have to try things out, which means we have to run experiments. We have to be comfortable with the idea that those experiments might not work in the way we anticipated them. So we need to get good at running experiments. So let's do a quick exercise. So I have a rule in my head, and some sequences of 3 numbers will follow that rule, and some sequences of numbers will not follow that rule. And your job is to try and discover what that rule is. So I'll give you this sequence of numbers to start off with. 2, 4, 8. The sequence of numbers 2, 4, 8 follow the rule that I know about. So start off with just thinking about the sequences of numbers. What sequence of numbers would you use to test a hypothesis? You're going to come up with a hypothesis for what you think the rule is. And you're going to test that hypothesis by giving me a sequence of numbers, and I'll tell you whether that sequence of numbers follows the rule or not. Yeah? So just have a think, and then I'll maybe get some people to call out some numbers. We'll see if anybody can guess the rule. Yep. 3, 6, and 12. Sorry?
3, 6, and 12.
3, 6, and 12 does follow the rule.
4, 8, 16.
Sorry?
4, 8, 16.
4, 8, 16 does follow the rule.
0 to 6.
0 to 6 does follow the rule. Okay, at this point, does anybody think they know what the rule is? Okay, any more tests? 210 does not follow the rule. Okay. Who learned something then? Who got some new information? Okay. Anybody now want to more tests? Anybody want to propose a hypothesis of what they think the rule is? Sorry?
Is that one that printed? Yeah. 0 to 4. So I was like going, mine was like 4, 6, 4, 8, 16. So it was like doubling every time. But when he did the 0
Yeah.
to 4, like 2 times 0.
Yeah. So we learn things when our hypothesis is disproved. Okay, so given, what did you say your hypothesis was?
So I think all the numbers need to be bigger than the last one.
Okay, yes, so that's the rule. The rule is as simple as the numbers increase in size. But that was the first hypothesis that I'm guessing you actively tried to disprove your hypothesis. Yeah? Our natural instinct is always to try and validate our hypothesis. We have an idea, we go with something that, if I think it's, double again, I'll go 1, 2, 4, 3, 6, 12. And all of those follow the rule. Now, if you're doing that, and I'm going, yeah, follow the rule, all I'm doing is confirming your bias towards your hypothesis. You're not really learning anything. As soon as somebody proposes something that doesn't follow your rule, we're like, oh, I was wrong. So that means when we're learning, we have to really maximize learning, we have to deliberately try and fail, which is really uncomfortable for us. Because one, it's, our natural bias is to try and confirm ourselves. Plus also, just failure is, has this negative notion. So we need to try and run experiments. We need to make changes that we think not just confirm our hypothesis and confirm our theories, but maybe try and disprove them as well. Now, in this example, it's really easy. I think when we're doing software development, it's not so easy to do. Because you need to make those experiments really kind of small and safe. So we talk about safe to fail experiments. So how can you test something in a way that's very low risk, you can get very quick feedback so that when you do get that information, you can use it quickly and you can kind of stop whatever the failure process you're putting in place is. So we're constantly running experiments. Organizational improvement is I think about organizations as being laboratories. So even our strategy, well, actually even our aspirations, our hypothesis, we don't know whether we can meet those aspirations. So you've got this big plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, study, adjust cycle at the, let's say at the yearly level, where we think we can meet these aspirations. Effectively, we're going to plan out some strategies, we're going to do some work on those strategies, study the results and adjust on it. Except at the annual level, that's a really slow feedback cycle. So for each tactic then, we're running nested experiments. So we take each tactic and say, this is an experiment in itself. And we need to do our own plan, do, study, adjust cycle on that. But even at that level, those tactics are probably quite big investments. So we break those down into even smaller experiments. And you can kind of break this down as many times as you like. But effectively, what you've got here is nested experimentation. So the result of these experiments down at the small level feed back into the next level above. And that feeds back into that level above. So hopefully, if your whole kind of annual hypothesis is wrong, you'll start getting feedback at the small level early, and you're not going to wait till the end of the year. So that outer level is really the X matrix. That X matrix is starting to form the big hypothesis we have about what we can achieve, how we go about achieving that, what sort of evidence we might see if we're going to achieve it, the sort of things we might start doing in order to achieve it. And then we start doing some stuff and we use something like the back briefing APE3. Let's actually start looking at some of these detailed things we might do and start understanding how to run some experiments. So break that down into smaller experiments. And then guess what? There's an A3 for actually detailed experiments as well. So down at the detail level, you're running these small experiments. Again, let's make sure we understand what the problem is. We're not just doing stuff for the sake of it. We're running an experiment because we think it's going to solve a specific problem. So maintaining alignment with our small experiments as well. What's our specific hypothesis? Let's state that up front. If we don't state the hypothesis up front, it's really easy to get into retrospective coherence and, oh, yeah, that worked because, yeah, we knew that was going to work, or we knew that wasn't going to work. So kind of disciplined scientific thinking here. Let's be clear on what hypothesis is and why. Again, we're not just doing stuff randomly. This should be coherent. We should be able to say why we think the hypothesis is true. What sort of supporting theories are there out there? So all this is again keeping alignment with the high level intent, and then start breaking that experiment down into specific actions. So making a specific plan. What are we actually going to do to prove or disprove the hypothesis? What results are we going to look for which are going to help us understand whether our hypothesis is true or false? So how are we going to declare success or failure? And then because we want these experiments to be kind of very small, low risk, safe to fail, probably means that if it's successful, we're going to follow it up in some way, roll the experiment out to a wider audience or amplify it in some way. Or equally, if it turns out that we just disproved our hypothesis, we might want to roll it back in some way. So how do we know? What are we going to do next? Let's just start thinking about that now. So going back to this diagram again, the X matrix is that thing that the central team forms up with. Then we form some smaller teams, do back briefing with them, and then we roll that out to some other teams to actually run the experiments. But here, we're not telling people what to do. We're just giving people the alignment, giving people the intent. And as we get down to the detail level, people can decide which experiments they want to run, but they've got that alignment back to what the original intent was. And we want to build some cadence around this as well. So I find a natural way to start this is to tie it in with the annual cycle. Most organisations run on an annual cycle. If you're on Read Beyond Budgeting, then there's a good story in there about so you can remember this, an accountant and a fisherman. And the accountant says to the fisherman, "Oh, what do you do?" And the fisherman says, "Oh, well, I go off to sea for 5 months and then I come back for 5 months." And the accountant's kind of looking really, really puzzled. He says, "What do you do for the other 2 months?" Because, we have this 12-month cycle and we think everything must run in 12 months. It doesn't have to, but it's usually a convenient place to start. So start the 12 months. Let's plan our year out. What aspirations do we want to achieve at the start of the year? What do we think our strategy is going to be to achieve those? Let's get some of those initial, what things should we invest in first? What evidence do we want to look for? And we start running some of these high-level learning cycles. This is kind of the back briefing side of things. And we break these down into these really smaller, finer grain learning cycles. On a quarterly basis, let's get back together and let's just review the original plan. So effectively, let's review the X matrix on a quarterly basis. What have we actually done? Does the strategy still feel right? Have we made any progress? Does the evidence look like we're likely to meet our aspirations? So when I was doing this, when I was working for Rally, we got to the end of Q1 one year and we went, strategy's wrong. This isn't going to work. And we had to go back and completely revisit the strategy for the year. But we figured that out after a quarter. And then every month, maybe you're doing a check-in as well, slightly higher. So this is kind of a fairly big thing, maybe a kind of full-day workshop to kind of really work through what have we done, what's working, what's not working, what are we going to do next. On a monthly basis, reviewing just the general progress that we're making so far, reviewing some of those pieces of evidence, looking for the things that are, things that are trending well, and the things that are not so trending well. Because if you've got a piece of evidence and we thought lead time was going to get shorter and it's not, do we need to spend some time investigating that some more? Does that team that's working on that tactic need some help? Do we need to get other people involved? What do we need to do differently? Or is it just that we need to give it some more time? So there's lots of little cycles in there, and then generally, on a kind of weekly basis, I want these that kind of refresh thing is constantly refreshing the metrics and the evidence. We want to get that feedback as soon as we can. So it's not just about becoming another whole set of meetings that enslave us, but it's having some cadences in place so we make sure we're getting that feedback early. So I want to come back, just to finish, come back to Stephen Bungay again, because he describes what he calls directed opportunism, but it's highly relevant, and hopefully you'll see that it kind of describes in a different way what I've just talked about. So he talks about three sides of things, three elements. Outcomes, so we want to achieve some outcomes as an organisation. In order to achieve those outcomes, we make some plans. Based on those plans, we take action, and those actions will lead to outcomes. And he talks about the three gaps between each of those three elements. The knowledge gap is the difference between what we would like to know and what we actually know. So when we're talking about what plans do we need to make to achieve some outcomes, we don't know everything. So there's this gap between what we need to know to make the right plans and what we actually know. And then we make the plans and we assume people are going to act on those plans, but there's this alignment gap between what people actually do and what we ask people to do. So we have the plan, and then there's what people do, and that's the alignment gap. And this is, so the term back briefing comes from Stephen Bungay here. So this is really where back briefing comes in, where people say, here's the action we're going to take based on the plan. And then the effects gap is people take action, and we assume that the action they're going to take will result in the outcome, but it doesn't always. So there's the difference between what we expect to happen and what actually happens. So the natural reaction to these three gaps is more detail. Let's have more detailed plans to close the knowledge gap. Based on those detailed plans, let's give people really detailed instructions so that they do the right thing. And then to make sure they're doing the right thing, we'll have really detailed controls in place. Who'll experience that before? Detailed plans, detailed instructions, detailed controls. And what Stephen Bungay says is, you need to go the other way. So we actually have less detail. So for the knowledge gap, you only define and communicate intent. Just give people the intent behind the plan. Don't give them any detailed information about what the plan should look like. And then allow people to come up with their plans and have this, as I said, have back briefing in place. So people can define how they're going to implement the plan themselves, and then give the people the freedom to adjust their plans and adjust their actions based on the intent when they actually start getting feedback. So we're actually giving people less detail, but having really strong alignment and really good feedback, so that as we learn, as we prove and disprove our hypotheses, we can adjust on the fly. So for me, Stephen Bungay doesn't talk about strategy deployment. I think he has a kind of brief mention at it right at the end of the book. But it's really, I think there's such a lot of overlap between the way he describes this and the way I think about strategy deployment. So that, hopefully that's kind of giving you some ideas. For me, this is all about how we roll out Agile. It's not just giving people plans and instructions and the detail of what your Agile implementation should look like. It's giving people the clarity of intent about why we're doing Agile, allowing people to come up with their own plans and their own actions and their own experiments for how they're going to put Agile into place, and then having feedback cycles and common metrics, common pieces of evidence to help us understand whether Agile is working or not. So the templates are there for download, if you'd like to use them. I'm actually running just kind of a slight bit of, I have to do a bit of marketing at the end. In a couple of weeks, I'm running a Lean Agile Strategy Day. So this is with Mike Burrows. So I think Mike's been up and talked. So I do a day worth of this. Mike does a day of his agenda shift stuff. I think of what Mike, does anybody who came and saw Mike when he came up here? Okay, a few of you. So Mike's approach to me is another form of strategy deployment. He's being clear on outcomes. He's got a way of allowing people to come up with their own plans and their own transformation mapping so that people can achieve those outcomes in their own way. So we're kind of looking at the synergy between those two. I think early bird pricing finishes today, but I can give you discount codes if you're interested. And then obviously this is my passion. This is what I try and do. I help organisations. So if you want to do some of these ideas, I'm kind of more than happy to help. And that's the book list. So I think I mentioned this. This is the X Matrix book. I'll make the slides available on Twitter, so you don't feel like you have to take a photograph. Although feel free to tweet your photographs. So yeah, this is the X Matrix book. I say it's kind of very manufacturing orientated. So you have to kind of look at it through a product development lens, and it's quite dry, but it's the best, if not the only, kind of X Matrix explanation I've read. So this is kind of what got me into this, really. This is I've not really mentioned this, but this is if you want a kind of a more accessible read on strategy deployment, this is a good one. It doesn't mention the X Matrix, but the idea of aligning an organisation around strategy. Bungay, the art of action I mentioned, and Marquez Turn the Ship Around. Good strategy, bad strategy. So once I started getting into strategy deployment, I realised that I knew nothing about strategy, which is kind of I felt was a bit of a flaw. So that's the best book I've read about kind of understanding if we're trying to help organisations define a strategy, and that's a really good one for kind of thinking about what makes good strategy. And then black box thinking is that's a kind of recent addition to this list. He really talks about failure and how organisations need to be befriend failure to be successful. Really good, some good stories, good examples in there. About for comparing, say, the airline industry, aviation industry. So somebody pointed out to me on Twitter today that, if you're getting an airline, you don't want it to fail. But actually, the aviation industry is really good at dealing with failure because they have black boxes. And as soon as there is an accident, they analyse that accident in detail because they want to stop that happening again in the future. They have, the airline industry has a real blame-free culture. They're not into finger pointing and blaming people. So if you give evidence as to do with an airline crash, you are kind of free from any kind of prosecution or anything in that way. They want people to be giving information about what happened. Compared to the healthcare industry, where if something happens, it was just a complication. Oh yeah, it's complex medicine. No interest in learning about how to avoid that, and there's kind of some good stories in there. And even when there has been learning, when they first just figured out that you should wash your hands before you go into the operating theatre, it took a long, long time before people recognised that was a good thing to do. So yeah, just a good book up a kind of the necessity. So I think that talk about failure. Failure is not an option. Yeah, I agree. Failure is not an option. It's actually necessary. We have to fail if we're going to learn. So there we go. Just read those books and it'll be fine. And that's it. I think I've got time for questions still.